Good morning. Thank you for joining us today, our webinar, Policy Tools for Effective Governance. I'm Mary Gardner Briggs, Senior Director of Research and Education Policy Development. And I'm joined here by my colleague Tezeta, Senior Director of Policy and Governance Technology Services. We're about to begin, so on the next slide, you will see that we have an agenda for today's presentation. We'll begin by discussing the importance of the board's role as local policymakers. We'll provide an overview of CSBA's new Board Policy Development Toolkit, cover some of the key principles from the framework, and go through some of the ways that you as governance team members might make use of the toolkit, share a few additional existing CSBA policy resources, and conclude with a Q&A. Before we begin, let's start with some housekeeping. First, use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. This is located on the ribbon below the speaker. The chat feature has been disabled for the webinar. Your questions will be answered either in the Q&A feature itself in writing or live by Tezeta or myself. All attendees will receive a link to this video recording as well as resources in a follow-up email within about 24 to 48 hours following the webinar. So let's begin with our first portion, the importance of board in the local policy.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Mary, for that introduction. As Mary said, we're here to talk to you about our board policy toolkit and excited to share some of the importance of board policies in your role as a local policymaker. So first, we wanted to kind of focus on why we put this toolkit together, and essentially it is because board members are local policymakers. There are several other kind of major levers that boards can exercise: adopting and monitoring budgets, hiring and evaluating the superintendent, approving local control and accountability plans, and monitoring district performance and student achievement. However, this presentation is going to focus on the board's role in adopting local policies as, again, a key responsibility and way to govern. So essentially, a governance team is made up of the board and the superintendent. They are a collective, and they have some key differences in their roles and responsibilities. So the board is expected to establish the vision and the governance framework. Usually that is done through policies. They are also expected to set expectations and priorities, as well as create accountability mechanisms for the superintendent. This is really about a focus on overall governance rather than the day-to-day operations of the district. And again, this role in the governance team is to make sure that you all are regularly reviewing and updating policies to make sure that they address the changing needs of the district. On the other side, we have the superintendent's role, which is to implement board policy through their leadership and administering the functions of the district. They're also responsible for translating that policy that is set by the governing board into programs and procedures, practices. So that's a focus on leading operations, but also keeping the board informed and aware of the expectations that they've been setting, as well as the priorities that the board has set. So that communication piece. And then finally, the expectation is that the superintendent would provide expertise and recommendations for policy development as needed. So again, some key roles here for both sides. And last but not least is the policy administrator. So this could be a different role in every district. Sometimes this is the superintendent also wearing that hat in very small districts. But essentially, this person is often the executive assistant to both the board and the superintendent. And this is a logistics role. Primarily, their responsibility is to alert staff, the superintendent, and the board of policy changes or updates to law. They're there to coordinate the review of those changes and make sure that revisions or updates to policy move through a clear workflow, starting with the review process, ending with adoption. and ensuring that those policies needing revision are brought to the board for discussion and then adoption. So again, this could be the executive assistant. This could be a series of executive assistants, depending on the size of the district. But this is a key role in ensuring that there's a workflow for the review and adoption of new policies. So together, we really wanted to emphasize that the governance team together has a couple of key roles, and that's to create a shared understanding of what the expectations are, both for the district functions as well as the governance team, to ensure that there's consistent, transparent, and legally compliant decision-making, to ensure that there's alignment, right? That governance team is governing with district goals and community expectations in mind, and then to support continuous improvement and organizational effectiveness. This helps keep the focus on student success rather than the minutia of operational details. So this is just to kind of give us a little bit of context for the board toolkit itself. Again, trying to emphasize that there's a key role here for board members as well as the superintendent in the policymaking process. Mary's going to take us through some of what we did to try to address this and kind of bring more I guess, information and resources to the board policy process. So I'll pass it back to you, Mary.
Yes, so in this section about the specific board policy development toolkit, you're going to learn what's in the toolkit and a little bit about each of the components. So on the next slide, you're going to see a little bit about the background that led us to this development of the toolkit. You know, we have at CSBA for years offered policy services, including sample policies that are aligned and consistent with education code and other statutes and regulations. But we really want to kind of lean into this idea of more than just sample policies that come to you in packets at board meetings, to really provide some tools and guidance that support member boards as you go through the process of adopting, reviewing, and amending policies. Because we feel like this is such a powerful lever, as you saw from what Tezeta was sharing. So in our strategic priorities, this was something that we were asked to do. Our policy services department collaborated with our research team, and we worked with board members throughout the field in the development of this process, and we piloted it with our members prior to refining it so that it was ready for you. We wanted it to be something that board members felt like it was usable and that they could understand it, that it would provide relevant resources throughout the process. So if you look on the next slide, you're going to see the different components that you'll find within this toolkit. And I want to highlight that through this strategic priority process, it was very important to CSBA that this be no cost to our members. This is one of the benefits of your membership at CSBA. So anyone who is a member has access to these resources on our website. Inside that toolkit, we have a policy framework and a framework 101, the individual board member reflection tool, a group tool that's called the board policy process evaluation, and a quick reference guide. And so what we'll do is kind of go through each of those components. So on the next slide, you're going to learn about that first tool for us. We're kind of combining these into one piece because they really touch on the same content. We just have a shorter version and a longer version, a condensed version, the Policy Framework 101, and the more in-depth framework for those of you that are ready for a deep dive and that really want to kind of drill down into some of the key concepts within this framework. This touches on a range of topics, including understanding board policies and their functions, your role in the policy adoption process, what constitutes strong board policies, best practices for review and adoption. And that, as we mentioned, the Policy Framework 101 is kind of a condensed way to dip your toes in the water. Maybe it's good for a new board member. Maybe it's good as just kind of a refresher. But that's kind of our foundational piece. And the rest of the pieces are built on the key principles within that framework. So on the next slide, what you'll see is some of the key principles highlighted throughout the framework. The idea that board policies should reflect local priorities, they should be compliant with state and federal law. They should really, think about implementation needs. While you as board members are not necessarily involved in the administration of the business of the district throughout the day, you really are responsible for kind of setting the tone and thinking about what resources need to be available throughout the implementation process, setting your staff up for success, so to speak. Considering the instructional impact, if that's relevant to a particular policy. Not all policies have instructional implications, but for those that do, to think about what that looks like for instruction in your county office or in your district. Thinking about the resources that are available, what kind of community engagement is included, particularly for substantive policies, things that have a major impact on community members. Considering the impact that it will have on different student groups and staff, this kind of equity component, and thinking about unintended consequences prior to adoption. Thinking about how data will be used to define success, and thinking about some of those other unintended consequences. Using those key principles, we brought that into our individual board member reflection. This component of the toolkit is a self-assessment tool to really help board members think about their policy literacy and what's happening at the local level. You do not need to have the entire board using this to be able to kind of stop, pause, and reflect on your particular understanding of policy and local practices. But we do think that it is also something that you could use prior to a group board study session or conversation, because I think it helps develop an understanding of some of the key concepts that might come up in those conversations. So that tool is, again, kind of a self-assessment. The next tool that you're going to see is this group board policy process evaluation tool. This is something that is really useful in working together as a governance team to build a strong policy culture within your LEA. It provides a structured starting point for those conversations, establishing norms and practices. And again, all of it is based on the key principles outlined within the framework. That is the foundational core of the toolkit. This looks like a rubric where each member of the governance team will have an opportunity to look at different spectrum, where the district falls on the spectrum for each of those key principles, shows kind of examples and criteria for those steps along the spectrum, and then can be brought together for a group conversation to think about next steps and implications for local practices. Finally, we have an individual quick reference guide. This is a tool that is for board members to refer to during substantive policy adoption discussions. There's a rubric to check alignment with the key components of effective policy review and adoption, and it's based on those core principles throughout the framework. This might not be something that needs to be used for every policy that is being reviewed. Sometimes you have a policy that's a very simple update. It might be something like your district needs to post posters in the staff lounge and in restrooms. That's not necessarily something that needs a deep analysis, but there are other examples that are really important for that. If you look at the next slide, kind of talk about using the toolkit. So within the toolkit, you're going to think about, there are lots of ways that you can configure this. And on the next slide, you'll see the policy life cycle. This gets outlined in the framework in more depth, but we have this process. If you think about your policy manual for your district, They are updated over different periods of time. This is kind of the life cycle if we're looking at one particular policy. This idea of moving from research and review, where you identify an issue and define whether or not it's something that's within your LEA's control. You look at the current policies and determine if it is warranted to develop or revise a policy. Moving into the analysis stage and drafting. Sometimes that involves using a CSBA sample policy. Sometimes this is something that originates locally. This feedback process, posting it for public review and comments, revising the document as needed so that it is both reflective of local priorities and community engagement as well as compliant with the law. Moving to the adoption stage, where it's presented to the board and is communicated to stakeholders to allow feedback prior to the vote. Measuring impact and implementation. Many times you might see something like review disaggregated data on an annual basis or on a biannual basis. Monitoring and tracking whether or not there are any changes to regulation or the law that might warrant updates. And again, if you are a Gamut subscriber, you will often receive information about those changes throughout the policy packet updates, but not always. And so you might want to be mindful of that. And again, there's kind of process is an ongoing process within your LEA. On the next slide, just a little bit of an overview for those of you that subscribe to Gamut Policy Services. We have a schedule through which we update policies. They come out in a packet in February, May, August, and November, and occasionally you will receive special updated packets as necessary. If legislation is passed that requires kind of an immediate response, that might be a special update. Your policy administrator, whether that's your superintendent or executive assistant, would bring these packets to your attention. And again, they don't need to necessarily be adopted at the time the packet is released in all cases, but keeping a regular schedule for updating your policies makes a situation where you're kind of not trying to play catch up all the time. On the next slide, kind of thinking about ways to use the toolkit. Again, as I mentioned, there is the opportunity to use these as part of an independent study for the framework and the self-reflection tool. Really great for new board members as a foundational understanding of how to leverage your role as policymakers, but also for experienced board members as a check-in to revisit those key principles and practices. In all honesty, during our pilot process, we had veteran board members who were reviewing this and felt like it was an eye-opening experience to be able to sit back and reflect on this and provided a kind of aspirational set of goals for moving forward. There are also ways to use these for board study sessions, beginning with the framework, developing that shared vocabulary and understanding the self-assessment, and then moving towards the group process evaluation. This might be particularly useful when you have new board members or superintendents who join the governance team. It might be an opportunity for revisiting group norms. Might also be something that, the governance team just feels like the time is right to improve local practices. And again, this quick reference guide is something that can be used on an ongoing basis for substantive policy discussions throughout the year. So on the next slide, Tezeta is going to walk you through how to incorporate the quick reference guide into policy discussions.
Thanks, Mary. So like Mary said, we wanted to come up with a variety of ways, a variety of entry points for board members to engage with the tools. So there are the more in-depth, expansive tools like the framework, as well as the board self-evaluation and the self-reflection tools. The quick reference guide was really meant to be something that you could use frequently. You can see from the snippet, it is structured as a kind of a checklist. So each of the kind of rows includes a policy principle that we touched on earlier. And again, the criteria that you could use to determine whether or not the policy that you're reviewing meets a certain criteria associated with that principle. So it also includes some key discussion questions for each principle and a way to document notes. So this could be used when you're at the dais. There are also ways where we're recommending you could engage with staff in preparation for discussions for your policy update cycle. So like Mary said, CSBA is updating our samples 4 times a year. Usually that is a good impetus for the district to decide, okay, we should also be looking at some of those policies that might have certain timelines when policies need to be changed, certain timelines where there is information that might need to be communicated to district staff or to students. And so again, thinking about that timeline, that policy life cycle, you could incorporate the quick reference guide into those discussions to help either prepare, again, for that live conversation that might be happening at a board meeting, or to again identify key questions for staff to consider in advance of those policy discussions. So again, this is meant to be a really quick tool. You could take it and print it out if you're still a paper and pencil person. Otherwise, this is also a really good document, I think, to attach or keep with your board agendas so that you, when you are reviewing policy, have a good rubric to assess or evaluate policy revisions on. So there's also some key takeaways for how you might want to structure this regular process of review at your district. For example, one of the key takeaways for me from the work that we did with districts is districts who are doing this on a regular basis are finding time to work on policy outside of those board meetings that can be jam-packed with other priority items. So the next idea that we want to introduce is the policy subcommittee. This is a smaller group that's focused on the development and revision of policy. Again, they could be meeting regularly, and it should be composed of various stakeholders. So this could include some of your LEA staff leadership, some of the employees, community members. This could include students. Most often we find that there are a subset of board members that are meeting, maybe sometimes more experienced board members, but also sometimes folks who are a little newer to the table who have a particular interest in policy development. And again, this is time that you would dedicate outside of those regular board meetings to be able to identify policies that need revising. Like we spoke about before in the policy life cycle, there are times when you are going to have a policy need that does not come from a CSBA policy update. Let's say there's a priority issue in your district. There might be a change in the members of the board, a change in superintendent, a community need. And so really to start those discussions, this is where we believe this is a good place for that work to start. And so the policy subcommittee has a little bit of a process that we've outlined. Some districts may be doing it differently. And so the first step could be to identify a small group willing to review policy outside of the main meeting. So as I mentioned before, it could include just board members. You could also expand that depending on the topic of the policy that's being discussed to other members of the community, other members of staff. We recommend using the toolkit to really set the groundwork for a committee like this to establish a common expectation. Let's say that this was getting off the ground at your district just starting this year. One way to use the toolkit might be to start with that board self-evaluation, or rather the framework, in order to really understand what is the work of policy. So again, the framework is there to kind of give an overarching sense of guidance around the policy development, some key principles to focus on so that folks are using similar language to talk about the work of the committee. The role of the committee itself would be to dive into the data, essentially gathering feedback and making recommendations for the board's final action. This isn't a place to make final decisions. This is really just the starting place for discussions about policy to find any information that might be helpful in those larger board discussions before the board policy is adopted. So the next step would be to take it out of the subcommittee and return it back to the agenda for the entire board to review those recommendations and any policies or new policies or revised policies. These should be happening in a public meeting, especially to allow for community input. And the kind of closeout of the policy subcommittee work might look like ongoing evaluation of impact. So this could look like starting with a policy that needs regular review, identifying what those are and creating checkpoints throughout the year to request additional data from staff, or making sure that this is something that's agendized for staff to provide additional data on in a public meeting. So we're going to shift over here now to discussing CSBA's other policy resources. But before I do that, Mary, is there anything we wanted to add about the impact or the possibilities for either the self-evaluation, the quick reference guide, or anything else around the policy lifecycle?
No, I think that you've kind of laid it out pretty well. I do think that it is something that, again, if you're an individual board member and you're looking at this as a personal, professional development tool, that's, really helpful. But it is also something that we think can be a tool that's really useful for the whole team.
True. And like I said, we ran the gamut, right? From tools that could be used with your whole entire team. So thinking about that as the board self-evaluation, doing that as a group, probably during a study session or at some point in the year, all the way to the quick reference guide, which again is meant to be used frequently or as needed throughout the year. The framework itself, I think, is a really comprehensive document that anyone could start with, regardless of your level of policy knowledge. And the self-evaluation is something that you can use independently. Before you jump into a big group setting, you may want to reflect on your own approach to policy. And again, these are all pieces of the toolkit. Next, we're going to talk about some of the other resources that exist to assist with policy development. So I'll pass that back to Mary.
All right. So CSBA has a series of existing policy resources. While the toolkit itself is free for any CSBA member. It's on our website at csba.org/policy toolkit. We also have subscription services through our Gamut policy. That's that sample policy manual, Gamut Policy Plus, and the quarterly policy update webinars that we've mentioned. We also have, as part of our Masters in Governance program, that's kind of our flagship professional development program, in Course 2, that focuses on policy and judicial review along with student learning and achievement. And we are looking and continuing to work with our trainings department to think about ways that these materials can be integrated throughout CSBA's suite of resources, but wanted to kind of make sure that those resources are available to you.
Mary, and I just wanted to maybe stop here and talk a little bit about the CSBA sample manual. That is really our primary reference guide for the content. If you're a board member who is not aware whether or not your district subscribes or has access, I would say the first starting place might be to reach out to that policy administrator or executive assistant to the board and superintendent to determine your level of access. Gamut Policy Plus is really the public platform that allows your community staff, others to be able to see your adopted policies at your district, which is also a subscription. And then our quarterly policy update webinars are accessible to every and anyone. I think we've linked some ways for you to access the upcoming one at the end of the slide. So again, if you're curious about any of these tools, you're not sure whether or not your LEA has access to them, please start with your district office. And if not, there will be a way to contact us at the end and we can assist with identifying whether or not, again, you have access to those resources.
Great.
So I'm going to shift over to talking about ways to get updated if you are seeking them. One thing we've realized in this process is that policy does not always bubble up to be the most exciting, or it's not the thing that most people are anticipating. And so what happens is folks can fall behind. Your district might not have looked at the manual in a number of years. CSBA issues these regularly. The laws are constantly changing. And so if your district or county office were to find yourself in a situation where you're needing some help in that process of revision, we offer two services. One of them is the Policy Development Workshop. As a comprehensive workshop that includes a consultant that'll work with your district office staff in order to, over the course of 3 days or so with the in-person version of it, to refine the CSBA samples, make edits to ensure that they reflect the local context. And at the end of the process, which is a little more than 3 days, it takes about 3 months to get to the end of the process, you have the results of a completely new and fully up-to-date policy manual. We've also been previewing a new structure for that workshop, which includes 1 day of in-person and some virtual follow-ups throughout the session to be able to be more responsive to the fact that folks are busy and may not be able to commit to a 3-day in-person workshop. There's also the policy manual review. This is an assessment of your existing policies. What we do is produce a report that identifies kind of where your policy manual is in comparison to the CSBA policy manual. We compare those dates and send that information to you. And we also outline some recommendations for next steps. If it is a PDW, really to bring everything all the way up to date, or if it's maybe a training to get your staff or that policy administrator some training to be able to understand what the cadence should be for reviewing policy. Maybe it's to work better with something like a policy subcommittee, and just some next steps for making sure that the logistics of your policy development process are taken care of. So those are the policy services that are administered directly through Policy and Governance Technology Services. I would say that the toolkit itself is a great supplement for those resources. As Mary said, we don't yet have a specific training on them, but all of these tools are now available for use online. As you have questions, we are really excited to hear feedback about how folks are using it. So now we're going to shift over to here and identify if there are any questions that you all have, perhaps about policy development at your district, what your role in it might be, or better ways to interact with the toolkit.
Yes, and thank you, Tezeta. Just as a reminder, please post any questions that you have within the Q&A portion of the toolbar below this window. We are happy to answer some questions. I have a few in my back pocket just in case we need them based on some of our other conversations. But before we begin, I want to just highlight something else that I think was really meaningful when Tezeta and I started this process. We engaged in a lot of different focus groups and conversations, thinking about what people needed. And I'm thinking back, Tezeta, to a conversation we had with our small school district advisory, and there was a board member from Central Coast who, when we were speaking to her, we kind of asked about, the policy process. And she mentioned the fact that, every time that, she runs into someone and mentions that she's a board member, they say, well, what does a board member do? She described her role as, I'm a local policymaker for our schools. And I think a lot of people really kind of tap into understanding the role of the board in setting vision and goals, but also, thinking about their role as fiduciary, oversight, and the well-being of the district's fiscal health. But this is something that we really hope we can really help our members kind of tap into, because this is a very powerful resource and ways that you can leverage your role as a board member. Okay, we see a few questions are starting to roll in. We have one from Laura Manuel. Please provide an example of using the toolkit with a sample CSBA board policy update. How might those two work together?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thanks, Laura. So, as we mentioned, CSBA is issuing policy update packets about 4 times a year. In those packets, we are identifying the key changes. If you're a Policy Plus subscriber, you're going to get a track changes version of that document. So, I think the first step would be to identify who that policy administrator is so that they could make the board aware that there is a set of updated policies that CSBA has issued to determine next steps for your district. Every district will not need every single policy. However, there needs to be a process to engage with that packet as it's been issued. So what I'd recommend is if you don't have a policy subcommittee, maybe that's something you want to explore. So that packet has a place to go. Absent a subcommittee, the recommendation would be to ensure that it's being routed for review by the appropriate staff. So identifying the policies in the packet, what division or department they might fall under, and so there are two kind of branches it could take after staff perform their initial review. And if there is no policy subcommittee, the board could be seeing those revisions for the first time when they open up that update packet. And so, I'm sorry, when they open up that board agenda. And so that quick reference guide that we mentioned that has a kind of place to keep notes, it has a list of the key policy principles on it, might be the first thing you want to take a glance at and get familiar with. So it asks some key discussion questions around each of the policy principles. So for example, implementation, if it's a policy that has ramifications for how some process might shift at the district, then a good question might be asked, how is this going to be implemented? That's something that the district staff might be able to generate some comments on before the board meeting takes place. Otherwise, that's something to engage in at the board meeting with staff about. So those are questions that you can ask from the dais. So that quick reference guide is, again, going to give you some key discussion questions for asking key principle related topical questions during that discussion. So that's one way, again, process wise, you could use it is right at the dais when you're being asked to review policy. I might recommend taking a look at the agenda when it's posted so that you can share those questions ahead of time so that staff are prepared to engage with them. But I really do think that I don't want to say the best because this is not a realistic option in every single district, but I would say having time outside of those board meetings to be able to engage with the revisions themselves and asking yourself those questions sometimes, identifying whether or not those questions have been answered for you, and if not, being able to engage in a meaningful way with district office staff about those during the discussion section. So again, I'm referring back to the quick reference guide. But there are also ways you might use the toolkit to do regular cycles of policy evaluation. So one way that Mary mentioned was starting with, if you have a new board or some new board members, doing a board self-evaluation around your policy process. If this is something that you notice there's been a lack of information around, or you want a little bit more of a structured process, starting off that school year with a study session to identify what your existing roles and responsibilities are, getting on the same page about expectations, reviewing those principles that come up in the key framework to identify, again, your position as a board. There's also the individual self-evaluation to understand your role and I guess positionality when it comes to policy development. Mary, you want to add anything to how folks might be able to use any piece of the toolkit in the update process?
No, I think that you've covered it. We have a great question that kind of, I think, ties into some of the conversations that we've had from Dr. Javier Ayala. And that is, when is it policy, practice, or preference? Like how do board members and superintendents in the governance team kind of approach that idea? Policy, practice, or preference?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I can give you the definition. So the board policy manual is made up of a couple different types of document. Board policies are what we tend to think of as the what. It is the primary communication from the board to the community and staff about what it is that the district expects. And again, these cover a variety of topics in the CSBA policy manual. They go all the way from your vision, your goals, comprehensive plans, all the way to your board bylaws. So again, the board policy is kind of seen as the what. It should be perennial in the sense of it is not changing every time an administrator changes. Rather, it is a reflection of the overarching expectations of the board on any number of issues or topics. The administrative regulations are the how of policy. These are not necessarily documents that the board has a lot of discretion around. The board has access to them similar to the community or may need to request access if they're curious, but the administrative regulations tend to be more process oriented. And then when we get to the question of practice, that's going to differ from district to district. So there isn't always a clear expectation for how those practices are documented, but I will say that the board policy manual is meant to be something that could live beyond any one individual administrator or board member. So as they're being developed, as they're being updated, the idea is that things that are perennial, process-oriented be documented in your board policy manual, whether that be as a BP, an AR, or as a board bylaw, and that things that might be a little bit below the level of district-wide practice, for example, a memo or other guidance documents, is where you might want to keep information related to practice that is connected to a process, a time-bound expectation. So I don't know if that's as clear as I'd like it to be. What I'm trying to explain is that the board policy manual is a document that is developed over time with the input of a lot of people, practices, and I'm not sure if I got the final part of the ask, and maybe we can
Preference.
preference. Got it. Are definitely not, the expectation is that those preferences may not necessarily be included in something like a board policy, and knowing how to discern when something rises to the level of board policy or administrative regulation. CSBA has some offerings around what we provide by way of our sample policies that again cover the whole gamut. I hate to keep using the word, but it is our software platform that provides access to the sample. So that gives you a lot of guidance around what topics, what subjects, what issues rise to the level of board policy or administrative regulation. If you're not seeing the topic in that board policy manual, it is likely that that is something that is a practice or I don't want to use the word preference, but it might be something that does not need to be necessarily included in a board policy manual, but could be something like additional guidance documents that are provided from district superintendent to district staff. But if we haven't answered that all the way, please do let me know, and we can kind of revisit.
I will say, Tezeta, that we do cover some of this in the full policy framework. Also thinking about, there's I think a graphic within the full framework that is kind of like a hierarchy of policies, like even down to like when is something that's more appropriate for a school handbook versus, a district-wide policy. And so I think that framework is a good place to go for kind of a more in-depth discussion of some of those components. We have some really good questions coming in here about some of the more technical pieces of like thinking about the policy rule. So I'm going to kind of jump around to some key pieces in terms of core understandings. So Jean King mentions that, the policies that we get are based on state and federal law with very little ability to change them. Kind of the concern that, by changing a policy from a sample policy, that might put the school district out of alignment with state or federal law. An example from their experience is that their board became unhappy with certain policies related to comprehensive sex ed instruction and curriculum, but there were certain things that couldn't be changed, K-12 versus grade span. So kind of want to speak to like, where is there flexibility? Where is there not flexibility? And when you want to make a more customized policy, what's the process for reviewing that for legal compliance?
Yeah, those are great questions. So I'll start us off, Marion. Feel free to jump in. But one thing I will say is that we have a really great image in the framework, and it's kind of like a little hierarchy. It's a little triangle. And it starts at the top with federal and state law, and down at the bottom, there are the local district policies and practices. And so keeping in mind that all of your policies are it is important that they are in alignment with the law. The policies that CSBA issues on a regular basis are usually summaries of that and then some, right? So they're going to reiterate the expectations that have been set at the federal or state level. Fortunately or unfortunately, we are not able to legislate from our desks, but there are places where CSBA provides opportunities to advocate for changes to those places where law may be, I guess, in conflict with your expectations of your community or your position as a board member. But I do think first and foremost, it's important to emphasize that these are kind of your legal guidance documents. And so when we're issuing updates, our effort is to make sure that our sample policy language is reflecting that state law. That said, there is some discretion in terms of how you can implement something. Sometimes you see that discretion in the policy update packet as this is optional language to include it or not include it. That CSBA trying our best to identify any promising practices around a policy topic. There are also the constraints of the law that we have to function within. So I think having access to the versions of the policies that give you a little bit more of the thinking that go into the CSBA samples might be a helpful place to start, Jean. Those note boxes that come in the CSBA sample policies offer some, again, the background or the thinking that go into the sections below it and really help to clarify what sections are modifiable and which sections, again, whether you change them or not, there's still the existing law. And in doubt, or if you were ever unsure of where there are places you can make changes, I would definitely recommend contacting your legal counsel or CSBA's county and district legal services in order to identify where that line is. But again, you are correct in that there are policy options or policy choices you can make, but they are somewhat constrained by our legal context, right, which is state and federal law. Do you want to
I'm
add?
thinking of an example of something that you and I worked on together years ago that relates to school districts' math placement policies. So there are certain components through state law that districts are required to follow when making decisions about where to place students in terms of their mathematics pathways. But there are still areas beyond that where districts can be making decisions about, what kinds of assessments they'll use, what their appeals process might entail. So again, there are certain components that must be complied with. You have to have a certain element of like objective assessment data when you're placing students in their mathematics coursework, but there are other components that you have some flexibility. So it really varies, I think, based on policy. And I think that anything that does vary from the sample policies that CSBA receives should always be reviewed by your local council, or as Tezeta mentioned, we have a district and county legal services program that can also provide legal guidance on that.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. There is one question I wanted to make sure that I addressed. It was about regarding policy that CSBA provides the district, and wondering whether or not there is a clear statement about whether a policy is recommended or required. Sometimes it's not clear, especially when it comes to certain policies. So the CSBA samples, some of you may be familiar with the structure of them, some of you may not, but there is a comprehensive list of mandated and conditionally mandated policies. It's a very long title, but if you are a subscriber to Gamut Policy, that list is available to you. If you want to have access to it, please contact us or your district administrator who has access to your CSBA sample site. But that gives you a very clear list of the policies that you are absolutely required to have by law. That said, just because a policy is not required, meaning you don't need to have a statement from the board to the public in your board policy manual, the laws are still the laws. And so whether or not you have a policy, the expectation is that you be following the law. So it's a subtle distinction, but again, if it is not on the conditionally mandated or mandated policy list, it is not a mandated policy. But again, anywhere we're citing law, which is usually very clear, the way that CSBA does its citations, those laws should be followed. And we think sometimes the best way to make sure everyone is on the same page about the policy is to make sure that you have, about the law, is to make sure that you have a policy on the topic. But let me know, like I said, we'll provide some contact information to make sure that folks who need it do have access to the conditionally mandated and mandated policy list.
And to kind of build on that, Tezeta, Samik Modi asked about, there's some policies that he believes Ed Code says needs to be reviewed by the board annually or some other frequency. Does CSBA help flag those for review?
Great question. So there are a few that have an annual requirement in law. I'd be happy to provide you with the board policy that outlines some of those. I do not have the number in my mind. That being said, though, a really great way to just stay on top of policy updates is to follow a regular schedule for updating. So what CSBA is doing on a quarterly basis is issuing update packets to ensure that you're getting in front of you things that have had meaningful legal changes or things that are out of date where we want to make sure we're getting new things in front of you. So if you are at least following a quarterly update cycle along with those CSBA updates, it is likely that you're going to review the documents that might need to be required on an annual basis. But I would be happy to provide you with a list of the ones that do have requirements in law if you reach out to us after the call.
Great. And then Michelle Sparks asks a question, how much in advance of a board meeting should board members be getting policy recommendations and updates?
That's a really good question. So typically we know board agendas are required just to be posted 72 hours in advance, but policy is something where you might want to have a little bit more of an opportunity to chew on it. So again, I would recommend we do a first reading and second reading. It's not exactly the requirement, but I do think that most districts are following that when it concerns policy. So if you're on a cadence of a monthly board meeting, you might do a first reading of those revised policy at one meeting, but the board might have about a month in between to review the recommended changes, pull out their quick reference guide, identify any questions that they might have for the staff, and address that in the second reading before adoption. So it really depends. Sometimes there are policies that do need to be changed immediately in order to be in alignment with expectations. So I understand that if the first reading, second reading aren't always, it's not always possible to do them that way. And again, there's a lot of discretions that boards and districts have to exercise around how they run their board meetings. But I would say at least giving them some time, about a month in between receiving a policy revision or a new policy for the first time. And then the meeting where they would be taking action on it feels like a good rule of thumb.
Mhm. Um, So I think that one other question I'm going to base on some of our conversations with members as we were previewing these materials is going back to the policy subcommittee. A lot of school districts don't necessarily have experience with a policy subcommittee, and I think we've heard questions about whether that's something that's appropriate for a small school district, and whether or not that they'll be able to field a group of members for the policy subcommittee. Do you have any thoughts about how might the policy subcommittee process be tailored to a smaller school district?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question I have is like, what are your available resources? Do you have very active community members who might be engaged? Do you have staff that might be engaged? Do you have students that might be a little more engaged? The subcommittee does not just have to be board members. It's anyone with an interest around policy, particularly staff. But if there is not the ability to have four regular meetings, right? Because sometimes it's about a time commitment. Maybe it's just an annual process to make sure that you have some level of review and engagement with your policies. The subcommittee structure itself could vary based off of, again, the resources available to you. So that's in composition and in time commitment. But I think that we've not done, I don't think as much with smalls, but I have seen the tremendous benefit of a policy subcommittee because, again, we're talking about the time and ability to really engage with the content. And in a board meeting that is already jam-packed, it might be difficult to get to some of those in a more granular way. But did you have anything, Mary, that you were thinking of?
No, I think that being mindful of the time commitment, because in small school districts, many times you have so many people wearing multiple hats, and so as you mentioned, thinking about the frequency of those meetings, even 2, 3 times a year, might create a situation where you're able to stay on top of things, but also have some more substantive conversation. I think that was one of the benefits of a policy subcommittee is feeling like, board meeting agendas are pretty packed. And so a lot of times items get put into consent agendas or that, people feel a pressure to limit the amount of discussion around policies because of how tight those agendas are. And that space within a policy subcommittee can really allow for careful review and reflection. We just recently had a situation at a district that approved an item in a consent agenda that later realized that there was a detail that they regretted not being able to see and have an opportunity to discuss. Those policy subcommittees are, in a way, an extra step of protection. And so finding ways to, maybe it's not a huge committee, maybe you look at the frequency, but it still has a benefit, no matter the district size.
And I just want to offer a plug too for a board study session. Some folks are just very at the very beginning of this conversation. So identifying it as important, right? Or identifying a process or who are the roles. So you may not be in the position where you are yet or ready to kind of run off and create this subcommittee and create a new process. Maybe the board self-evaluation or the board policy process self-evaluation or board policy process evaluation tool is a good place to start. So you could identify, again, where there is alignment or where there are differences across the board in terms of, where your district is in this process. So I think what I'm trying to say is that you might want to start with getting on the same page, right? About how to prioritize policy, understanding this as an important lever of control in your district. And then that self-evaluation gives some ideas for next steps in the evolution. Maybe all the way on this end is a board policy subcommittee, but if you can't do that, maybe it's just making sure that you have a process for identifying when CSBA has issued an update packet or when there is room for revision in something that is of particular interest to your community or your staff, and identifying a process for revising, getting community input, and then adopting new language. So that may not be the right next step for you, but I think that the board process evaluation is a good place to start for a board that's just starting to engage in some of these questions.
So, Dr. Ayala also asked, is there a framework for assessing policy equity impact? And I'll just start, Tezeta, if that's all right, to say we don't have like an in-depth framework where it's like the same level of like look at each criteria in the toolkit. But I think that best practices include when we are asking folks to look at unintended consequences, to think about the different student groups represented in your community, thinking about the community engagement with key educational partners to discuss whether or not there might be some blind spots in thinking about the impact of a particular process. And then I think the other component that we talk about a little bit in the framework is thinking about on the implementation side, what kind of data might be collected as part of that policy, to say, to look at disaggregated data. We've seen this with, for instance, school discipline data, to revisit disaggregated data on an annual basis, to look at, are there things happening at the local level that might warrant revisiting that policy and the impact that it's having from an equity level? Tezeta, did you have anything that you feel might be appropriate?
No, just that it's a key principle that we address in the framework, along with some language about how to assess it. Again, discussion questions to ask to make sure you're really getting underneath the data. That's kind of the purpose of that principle, and there's more information in this toolkit.
Great. One quick little thing before we go on to our kind of like final comments on this. Had a question about getting boards engaged in classes and professional learning. I would really just, although this isn't the focus of our presentation, we care very deeply about that kind of professional learning component. I would really encourage you to work with your local PACER, your public affairs and community engagement representative and superintendent, to also kind of do that. We've recently put out some information about board professional learning that is available on our website. You can email me at mbriggs, M for Mary, Briggs, Briggs, at csba.org, and I can get those materials to you. It has some information about the importance of board member professional learning. But Tezeta, I think we have a couple of closing thoughts, key takeaways. So just to remember, key things from our conversation today, policymaking is a key lever of effective governance, and our toolkit is free, available to our members. It's a way to strengthen local policy review and adoption. You can access the toolkit at csba.org/policy toolkit. It's also available under effective governance under our governance resources. As Tezeta mentioned, it's really important to know your district's point person or people for policy processing. And if you have a lot of questions after you look at the toolkit and you think about, oh, why do we do this a particular way in our district? They might be the place to start for some of those initial questions. If you're not sure how to access those gamut resources, they are really helpful resources there. Just a couple of other little things. We have a webinar coming up on August 26th at 11 a.m. That's going to be what Tezeta referenced and I referenced, those kind of quarterly update packets. There's an inside look at that policy packet. We also have 2 upcoming Masters in Governance courses on policy and judicial review. For county offices, that's an in-person training, I believe at the either Woodland Unified or Yolo County Office of Education is here in Northern California on August 14th. And the district's version of this Masters in Governance course begins on September 22nd. That one is virtual, so no travel required for that one. So appreciate all of your time, Tezeta. Any closing thoughts before we sign off?
Not for me. Thanks you all for attending. We really appreciate it and looking forward to feedback as you have it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.